Amen. Thank you so much, Montana. You nailed the theme of the day. You do such a nice job. And Timmy and Andrew, you're my heroes for being here this morning at the 8 o'clock service in Montana. I'm thinking that they're thinking that even if they knew the Girl Scout motto, they would not admit it. They just would, because they're real men. They wouldn't admit that probably. And I'm thinking with no Sunday school today that we might very well have quite a few kids actually at the next service. But thank you so much for being a part of our church. The kids, we're so grateful that they're here. And we do want to wish you a happy New Year, church, as we begin a new church year today with Advent, this first Sunday in Advent. And as Montana just mentioned, the theme of the day really is preparing for the coming of the King. You'll recall that the word Advent literally means arrival. As we think of the arrival of Jesus' birthday in a little more than 4 weeks, and as we think of the arrival of Jesus' return. And the lessons for today really focus on that second part of it, Jesus coming again. Let's take a closer look. If you'll open up your Bibles to Isaiah chapter 2, you'll find this on page 980. Let's take a look at verse 4 together as a congregation. Page 980. And let's read verse 4 together. It's near the top of the page there. In verse 4, the prophet Isaiah says this. Let's read it. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will take sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. In other words, we're reminded here that Advent calls us to peace. And the picture that Isaiah gives us here is really a picture of peace breaking out all over, isn't it? If you take a look at the study note in the margin there to the left, you'll notice that it poses the question, if the world is ending, why bother to settle disputes amongst the people? And it goes on to explain that biblical faith does not see the world ending in emptiness and disharmony, but rather it looks forward to a time when love and peace prevails among the nations. Yes, Advent calls us to peace. And the study note goes on to explain that there are different views of how the end times will unfold. Well, regardless of what end time view we might hold to, nevertheless, it may be hard for us to imagine a day in which love and peace will prevail amongst the nations. You'll notice in verse 4 that the prophet says, nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. It's hard to imagine that kind of a day, isn't it? Where nations will not be training for war. Our boys, Steve and Tom, could not be home for Thanksgiving because they're in the Navy. And as you know, they've been training to be prepared for that day, God forbid, when they might have to go to battle. Or that day they might have to go to war. We hope, of course, that they don't have to do that. But we do know that we live in the midst of a world where conflicts abound. I have to say it made me a little bit nervous to hear in the news earlier this week that Chinese jets were scrambled in response to U.S. Navy activity in the region there. And yet it was heartwarming for me to read later in the week that young urban Iranians find the chance of death to USA from the 70s to be very, very passé. Wouldn't it be encouraging to believe that younger Iranians are less interested in war and more interested in peace? Yes, Advent is a season that calls us to peace. And you'll notice the very last part of the study note says, regardless of which end time view we hold to, regardless, we must work toward that day, helping nation and peoples reconcile their differences. Some of us are old enough to remember some of the protest songs of the 1960s. And one of them, the words went, "Let there be peace on earth and let it begin with me." And I think that's a good question for us in the church today. How do we let peace begin with us? Unfortunately, Thanksgiving is a time in which there isn't always peace in families, especially if there's an empty seat at the table, where we've lost a loved one, and rather Thanksgiving is a time for grieving. And unfortunately, in some families, Thanksgiving is a time where old family hurts and tensions sometimes rise. So how can we let peace begin with us? Let's talk about that for just a moment here. How can we be peacemakers in our families and in our world today and in our neighborhoods and in our churches? What are some things that we can do that might make for peace? What do you think? Forgiveness is a big one, isn't it? Absolutely. One of the main things we are to be about as a church. What else can we do to make for peace? What's that? Giving. Being generous people. Giving something. You bet. Absolutely. That's a great way to make for peace. Don, were you going to say something? Or Luann? Demonstrate grace. Demonstrate grace. You bet. You bet. What was that? Don't rise to the bait of the argument. I'm reminded of James, where we earlier talked this fall about be slow to speak, slow to anger, and quick to listen. Listen. Some other ways we can make for peace. Yeah, Jerry. Smile. The power of a smile. Yeah, the power of a smile. Absolutely. You bet. It's a great way to make for peace. Any other thoughts? Being quicker to compliment than quick to criticize can help make for peace. How about in schools? How are some ways that we can make for peace? How about standing up against bullies or bullying behavior? Great way to make for peace in our world today. There's a lot of things we can do. That's really our business as a church, is to be peacemakers in our world today. And Advent is a season that calls us to peace. So let's take a look at what Jesus has to say about the end times in our gospel lesson for this morning. Let's turn secondly to that. That's Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24, and let's read together verse 44. You'll find this on page 1424. Again, under the title, Day and Hour Unknown. And let's read together what Jesus says at the very end of our reading for today. That was verse 44, near the bottom of the page. In verse 44, Jesus says this. Let's read it. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. In other words, Advent calls us to readiness. Can there be any question but that the Broncos weren't quite ready Sunday night for the Patriots to score 31 points in the second half? I think so. I think they weren't quite ready for that. I mean, I know they're professionals, and I know they know that people can come back, but it would appear as if they let down their guard just for a little bit. Just for a little bit. And you know what? When we let down our guard for just a little bit, bad things can happen in our lives. The same thing's true spiritually, isn't it? When we let down our guard just a little bit, and we back off of worship, or we back off of reading Scripture, or we back off of prayer, or we back off of living out our Christian faith, bad things can happen. So notice in verse 36, Jesus says, no one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son. Now, part of us might be a little bit skeptical about that last part. We might think, oh, come on, Jesus, you had to have known. You had to have known, because after all, you are the Son of God. But you know what? Sometimes we choose not to know. You know, 22 years ago, when Cindy was pregnant with Matt, we chose to know. We chose to know the gender of our child at that point, and so we were looking forward to Maddie's arrival. But many couples choose not to know. Sometimes we choose not to know things. And here it would appear that Jesus chose not to know when the day or hour would be for his return. But notice what he does know. What does he know? He knows how swiftly it will come, and he uses the image, first of all, here of what? As swift as a... Go ahead and take a look. The first image that he uses here. A flood, absolutely. As swift as a flood. And Diane mentions that flood in her devotions in your bulletin as well. Well, we know a little bit more about floods now around here, don't we? How many of you have had a chance to see some of the devastation in Lyons? Have you gone up through Lyons? Some of you live in Lyons, so you know the devastation. And you know from the way that houses were pushed off their foundations and carried down the stream. And you know by the way that roadbeds were ripped away from the mountains. We know from the way that cars were tumbled upside down and crushed like little toys. We know of the power of that swiftly approaching flood. What devastation that brings. So notice what Jesus has to say here in verse 37 and following. He says, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be with the coming of the Son of Man. Yes, Advent calls us to readiness. Readiness to meet our Maker. We had a wonderful Thanksgiving at our house, and we had about 15 guests and from the church here, and Nick sang some of his songs and played guitar, and Lorelei played the piano. And Cindy even got out her accordion and played her accordion. How many accordion players do we have here in the church? That's what I thought. Now, would you even admit it? Would you admit it if you were an accordion player? I mean, if you wanted to establish yourself as a very hip and cool person, grabbing the accordion is probably not the way you would do that. But Cindy grabbed her accordion, and we had a good time. And I was explaining to some of our guests as they arrived that we've been in this house about 10 years, and this is the third house we've built since we've been here in Longmont. And I was recalling this week how with previous houses, when we had been selling them and they'd been on the market, it never ceased to fail that the phone would ring to show the house at the most inopportune time. When we were busiest, or when the house was maybe the messiest. In fact, I remember one time I was writing those very words down in a sermon about this time of the year, when you guessed it, the phone rang, asking if they could show the house in about 30 minutes. Well, this was a Saturday, and I had been fighting a cold and a flu bug all week long. I did not have my sermon quite done, and I was home alone with the boys. Cindy was doing a children's ministry workshop down in Denver, but sure, we would be happy to show the house in about 30 minutes. And so after I said goodbye, I slammed down the phone, and I started running around the house like an absolute madman. You know how it is in the movies when they put the movie in fast forward? That was me. I mean, I was sweeping the toys off of the kitchen counter and the kitchen table, and I was scooping up the Nintendo games from the fireside room, and I was stuffing boys' clothes into drawers in the bedrooms, and I was spraying lemon-smelling stuff in all of the sinks. And so 30 minutes later, sweat is literally dripping from my nose when little Tommy, about 7 years old at that time, little Tommy walks in. I say, "Tommy, the realtor's coming in a few minutes." Tommy looks at me wide-eyed, and he says, "Bet you're glad we kept the house picked up, huh, Dad?" Because you see, to him, the house looked pretty good. But you see, I wanted it to look its best. And I really think that's what Jesus is getting at here in this story. It's only natural that we would want to look our best. That we would want to look our best for Jesus' arrival, for Jesus' return. And it's only natural that Jesus would want us to look our best for his return as well. So take a look at what follows with chapter 25. Chapter 25 has three stories, three parables, if you will, and all three call us to readiness. And all three stories call us to watchfulness. And all three stories call us to preparation, to prepare the way of the king. The parable of the 10 virgins, the parable of the talents, and the story of the sheep and the goats. I've asked my 8th grade confirmation students through the years, so what would you like to be caught doing when Jesus returns? And of course, the initial answers are usually along the lines of, well, I'd like to be caught praying. Or I'd like to be caught worshiping. Or I'd like to be caught reading my Bible. But of course, as we think about it and talk about it a little bit more, we start to get more answers along the lines of, well, I'd like to be caught maybe helping somebody. Right in the midst of helping somebody. Have you seen some of those videos on the internet and Facebook where people are in the grocery store and somebody runs out of money, they don't have quite enough money, and then everybody around them starts to pitch in and to help. And it's very, very heartwarming. And some of the answers the kids might give is that they'd like to be caught in the act of apologizing to someone or making peace. Or they'd like to be caught in the act of sharing their faith. Wouldn't that be cool? Get caught in the act of sharing faith when Jesus returns. Clearly, Jesus, as he speaks to his disciples here in Matthew 24, is inviting them to get ready, to be watching, to be waiting, to prepare for Jesus coming again. And it will be as swift as the flood in the days of Noah. So lastly, let's take a look at what Paul has to say as he talks about the end times in his letter to the Romans chapter 13. If you'll turn to Romans 13 as we close here, let's take a closer look. You'll find this on page 1627. And let's read together verse 12 near the top of the page, 1627. We're speaking of the end times. Jesus says this in verse 12, Paul in verse 12 says this. Let's read it together. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. I love that image there, the armor of light. And he goes on in verse 13 to describe behavior that is indecent behavior that we are called to avoid. But you'll notice that this whole section of the chapter falls under the heading love. Love, for the day is near. And in verse 10 he says, love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. So that I believe we're reminded lastly here this morning that the Advent calls us to love. Cindy and Matt and I saw the movie The Hunger Games on Friday afternoon. How many of you have seen Hunger Games? Okay, a few of you, and maybe you saw the previous movie, and so you know that it's a love story in part, and like the first movie, it's a rather dark movie where a very powerful, rich, elite group of people have enslaved everyone else. They've enslaved everyone else. And just for their entertainment, they have selected very talented young people to have a contest to pursue one another and to fight to the death. Never quite knowing who it is they can trust, if anyone. How dark is that? How would you like to live in a world where you never quite know who it is that you can trust? As the movie unfolds, as the story unfolds, we begin to see that there are those who no longer want to live in slavery, and they are finding the courage to step out and to protect one another as human shields, to protect their families and their loved ones and the defenseless as human shields. And you'll notice that Paul uses a military image too in this verse 12. He says, let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. I love the way that Pastor Eric last week talked about chesed, God's loving kindness. And God's loving kindness, of course, is what we are called to show one another in our world today. And God's loving kindness is really our most important job as a church. That's our most important job here on earth, is to reflect God's loving kindness towards one another. It occurred to me as we were beginning a new church year here that we've seen a lot of change here at Faith Community in the last couple of years. I mean, depending on how you count it, five new staff members in the last 2 years, new denomination, new offices, new pastors this last year, new worship service, new overflow parking as of tomorrow. A lot of newness. In the midst of all the newness, chesed reminds me of the most important thing we are to be about as a church. Showing chesed to one another. Showing God's chesed to the world around us. And I'm always, always amazed and astounded at what great ministry God can produce and raise up in the midst of an environment of Hansen. Yes, Advent calls us to love. Let's pray.